the king's most trusted man. The strangest and most powerful title of the Middle Ages, the keeper of the king's toilet. Imagine the 1400s, England, deep inside Windsor Castle, a corridor surrounded by stone walls, lit by the glow of torches. The early hours of the morning. Most of the palace is still asleep. But not one man. This man rose before the sun. He has put on his special gloves. Duty calls him, because this morning he will be attending to the toilet of King Henry IV of England. And know this man is one of the wealthiest, most influential, and most trusted people in the entire palace. To slander him is a death warrant. For him to fall from grace means the collapse of an entire family. Today I am going to tell you about the groom of the stool, that is, the king's toilet attendant. And I promise you, this is a far stranger, far more complex and far more fascinating story than you could ever imagine. Section 1. What did this title mean and how did it come about? First, let us clarify, what does groom of the stool actually mean? The word groom in Middle English meant servant or assistant. Stool was the polite name given to the toilet. So the full translation is, attendant of the defecation stool. Yes, this is real. Tane. This title first appeared in England in the late 15th century, during the reign of King Henry VII. But why was such a role ever needed? Court life in the medieval and Renaissance periods was bound by protocol to a degree modern people can barely fathom. The king was not merely a human being. The king was God's representative on earth, a sacred being. And every movement, every action of a sacred being had been transformed into a ritual. Rising in the morning, ritual. Getting dressed, ritual. Eating, ritual. And yes, going to the toilet, ritual. The king's private toilet was called the close stool. In reality, it was a portable chair with a wooden receptacle inside, covered in velvet and leather. When the king sat upon this chair, a specially chosen individual would be present, one deemed worthy of the honor of this duty. What exactly did this person do? The first and most obvious duty was this: to be present, to stand beside the king while he relieved himself. But wait, things become far more interesting. Because according to the medical understanding of the era, the most reliable way to monitor the health of a monarch was to examine his excrement. Yes, truly, royal physicians would assess the king's state of health in this very manner. And who carried out this assessment? Who reported back to the doctor? The groom of the stool. This person was witness to the king's most intimate moments. That alone placed him in what appeared to be the most ordinary, yet was in fact the most strategically vital position in the entire palace. Section 2. So who was chosen for this role? Now let us come to the truly surprising part. Who do you think was chosen for this role? A peasant? Someone from the lowest rung of the palace hierarchy? No, quite the opposite. The groom of the stool was typically drawn from the most noble families, usually a duke or an earl, and counted among the most prestigious figures in the entire court. Looking at English history, those appointed to this position included, first, the Stafford family, among the most powerful nobles in England. Second, the Cromwell family. Yes, that Cromwell family. Third, the Denny family, the closest advisors to Henry V. So why was it so coveted? Because this position granted you direct, continuous, and uninterrupted access to the king. In medieval politics, proximity to the king was everything. A law required the king's signature to pass. An appointment required the king's approval. Ending a war required the king's decision. And to reach the king, someone he trusted had to act as intermediary. The groom of the stool was precisely that intermediary. Consider this. Every morning when the king went to the toilet, the groom of the stool was there beside him. In those few minutes, he could speak with the king. He could make a request. He could whisper something about an enemy into his ear. He could steal a march on a rival. Great ambassadors, ministers, generals, all of them waited in line for access to the king. But the groom of the stool, he was there every single morning. already there. And this power soon took on a very concrete form. Over time, the groom of the stool was no longer merely a toilet attendant. He became the head of the privy chamber, the king's private apartments. He oversaw the king's personal correspondence. He decided who was permitted to enter the king's bedchamber. One title, one toilet, and this much power. Section 3. The reign of Henry VIII, the Golden Age. Let us now travel to the true peak of this title, the reign of King Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547. Henry VIII is one of history's most charismatic, most dangerous, and most controversial monarchs. He is known for his 6 wives, his countless executions, and the decisions that fundamentally transformed the Church of England. But he is also the king who turned the position of groom of the stool into one of the most powerful court titles in history. The person who held this position during his reign, Sir Henry Norris. And the story of Norris is a perfect illustration of just how dangerous a game of power this position could become. Henry Norris was Henry VIII's most trusted man throughout the 1530s. He managed the king's private apartments. He was in contact with nearly every significant figure in the palace. He carried messages on the king's behalf. He influenced appointments. And until 1536, everything was going smoothly. 1536, one of the bloodiest years in English political history. King Henry VIII had decided to divorce his second wife, Anne Boleyn, but this was not merely a divorce. Henry wanted Anne executed. For that he needed a pretext. Names were required to prove Anne Boleyn's infidelity. With whom had she betrayed her husband? When the prosecutors announced their list, the first name on it was Henry Norris. Dramatic music swells. Norris was innocent. Almost everyone knew it. But the groom of the stool's extraordinary closeness to the king made him an equally perfect target for the king's enemies. Norris was declared guilty on the basis of confessions obtained under torture, and on the 17th of May 1536, he was beheaded at the Tower of London. This event sent a very clear message to everyone in the palace. Being close to the king makes you powerful, but it also makes you a target. The grooms of the stool who followed Norris never forgot that lesson. Thomas Heneage and a new era. Thomas Heneage was appointed to fill the vacancy left by Norris's execution. Heneage pursued a far more cautious policy. He maintained his closeness to the king, but never allowed himself to be pushed to the forefront. It was precisely this art of balance that kept him standing for years, and during this period, something else became apparent. The groom of the stool was no longer merely concerned with toilet duties, but with the coordination of the king's entire private life. Section 4. The daily routine. From dawn to dusk. Now let us live through a day together. A day in an English palace in the late 15th century, seen through the eyes of the groom of the stool. 4:30 a.m. Waking up. The groom of the stool rises before anyone else. His own toilet, his own wash, his own dressing. Because today he will be at the king's side, and being at the king's side means always being ready, always being clean, always appearing dignified. 5 a.m. Preparation. Inspecting the closed stool, the king's portable toilet chair, ensuring the basin inside has been cleaned, that the fabric coverings are properly arranged. Everything must be ready for the morning ceremony. At the same time, a meeting with the palace physician about this morning. A report on the color and consistency of the king's previous day's excrement. The doctor will use this information to determine what the king should eat and drink today. 6 a.m. The king wakes. The groom of the stool waits at the door of the king's bedchamber. When the door opens, he oversees the presentation of the special towels brought for washing the king's face. He is also present for the king's dressing ceremony. This ceremony, known as the levee, can last up to an hour. When the king puts on his shirt, the groom of the stool holds it personally. His stockings, the groom puts them on. His shoes, the groom buckles them. 7:30 a.m. Toilet time. And then the moment arrives. The king makes his way to the closed stool. The groom of the stool clears everyone else from the room. Only he remains. And he waits. This period could last anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes. and throughout that time the groom of the stool could speak with the king. He might have matters to raise, or a request to make, or he simply waited in silence. Either option was a power play: to speak, to access the king's mind; to stay silent, to deepen the king's trust. Throughout the day, the groom of the stool does not attend meetings in the palace, but after those meetings concludes he briefs the king: which noble said what, which messenger arrived, which petition was presented. He also determines who may enter and exit the privy chamber. This list is the clearest indicator of who is in favor that day, and who has fallen out of it. Night, the closing before the king retires. The groom of the stool accompanies him for the close stool ceremony once more. He helps the king into his nightclothes, and when at last the king sleeps, the groom of the stool withdraws to his own chamber. But he spends that night processing everything seen and heard throughout the day, because knowledge is power, and he knows everything. Section 5. Scotland, France, and similar roles across Europe. This peculiar tradition was not unique to England. Similar positions existed in the great courts of Europe. France, Premier Gentilhomme de la Chambre. In the French court, the person who held this role carried the title of First Gentleman of the Chamber. His duties were almost identical to his English counterpart: to accompany the king during his morning rituals, to manage his private apartments, and to be present during his most intimate moments. During the reign of Louis XIV, this position became the political epicenter of the Palace of Versailles. The person who decided who could enter the room when the king awoke each morning determined who held power on that particular day. One of history's most famous expressions comes from this period: being at Versailles. To remain outside the palace meant, politically speaking, to cease to exist. The Ottoman Empire, the Hazo da Agahas. A similar structure existed at Topkapi Palace. The Hazo da Agahas, those who had access to the Sultan's most private chamber, the Hazoda, were the most trusted men of the Sultan. These individuals attended to the Sultan's daily needs, carried his private correspondence, and filtered the news arriving from outside. The rise or fall of a statesman was, more often than not, shaped within the Hazoda. Spain, Sumiller de Corps. In the Spanish court, the position of Sumiller de Corps, meaning gentleman of the body, fulfilled similar functions. In this court, the Spanish extension of the Habsburg dynasty, physical proximity to the king translated directly into political power. All of these examples demonstrate a single truth: power resides in intimacy. The person who bears witness to a sovereign's most vulnerable, most human moments, becomes the one most similar to him, the most trusted, the one with the greatest capacity for influence. Section 6. The end of power. How did this position decline? Everything comes to an end, and so did the groom of the stool. But this decline did not happen overnight. The 17th century, the first cracks during the reign of King James I, 1603–1625, the position began to take on a more institutional character. Power was no longer concentrated in a single person's hands, but was distributed across a broader privy chamber administration. During this period, serious rivalry erupted between Scottish and English nobles over the position. James's favorite figures held onto it, but it no longer carried the same political weight as before. The 18th century, symbolic transformation. During the reigns of George II and George III, the position became largely symbolic. There was no longer any real question of actual toilet duties. The title survived, but its substance had been hollowed out. There were several reasons for this. First, advances in medicine. Physicians could now monitor the king's health through far more sophisticated methods. Examining excrement was no longer as critical as it once had been. Second, the transformation of politics. As Parliament grew stronger, one individual's access to the king ceased to be so determinative. The 19th century, the formal end. When Queen Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837, the position was effectively abolished, because Victoria was a woman, and it was no longer considered appropriate by protocol for male nobles to assume this duty. But note,
The position did not disappear entirely, it simply transformed. Today, the title of Groom of the Stool still exists, but it is now entirely honorary. There is no real duty, no real power, only a memento left behind by this curious chapter of history. Section 7. Reflections on the modern world. Is power still hidden in intimacy? Let us now take a step back and ask, what is this story actually telling us? The existence of the Groom of the Stool reveals a universal truth in human history. Power resides in proximity. The same logic operates today, only the names have changed. Think of a company. Who is the CEO's assistant? Who arranges the meeting calendar? Whose call gets put through, and whose does not? This person may not be the most officially powerful person in the company, but they occupy the very top of the informal power hierarchy. Or consider a government, the president's chief of staff. Which file lands on the desk? Which advisor's voice is heard? Who gets shown into the office? And who is left waiting in the anteroom? There is a deep continuity between the medieval Groom of the Stool and the modern world's, quote, gatekeepers, quote. Power is not always concealed in formal titles. It is hidden in daily access. Who is there in the mornings? Who is at his side in the evenings? Who is privy to the most intimate moments? The answers to these questions reveal the true map of power.
Closing the story of the Groom of the Stool shows us how something that appears absurd on the surface can carry meaning of the greatest depth. A toilet duty, but in reality, a position of power. A service role, but in reality, an advisory post. An embarrassing job, but in reality, a throne that the most powerful families competed for across generations. History constantly delivers us the same lesson. Status is not always visible, power is not always loud, and the most important people are not always those who hold the grandest titles. Sometimes the most important person is simply the one who is there at 6 o'clock in the morning. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss my upcoming videos about other strange yet deeply meaningful positions in history. You are in a deep sleep right now. See you in the next video.